I would say that is, as we know, Islam is a religion of balance. And there are many examples of Islamic figures who were disabled and contributed greatly to Islamic history. Yet history doesn't necessarily repeat itself or is even reflected in our current time. A prime example of mosques are not accessible. Hajj is a very difficult concept for a disabled pilgrimage, financially and physically. Attitude of people, this constant judging and association of disability with religion is another factor. It's all daily obstacles that a disabled Muslim has to deal with and overcome without feeling that we are less Muslims than our fellow worshippers. Also, the really important thing that I need to address or make clear is the difference between teaching of Islam and the inherited cultural ideas and tradition. It's important to recognize every individual in their own right, with their own unique circumstances and their own behavior, attitude, etc. Therefore, we should not judge a person at all, as we will not know who's wrong or right until the day of judgment. As I said, it's important to learn from historical facts to understand our present and develop our future, specifically where disability is concerned. During the high centuries of the Islamic civilization, a significant number of visually impaired, hearing impaired, and physically disabled people played notable roles as philologists, transmitters of the law, teachers, poets, and social commentators. They included Abu Ala al-Ma'arri, Abu Uthman, Amr ibn Bahar al-Jihaz, Ibn Sirin, Qatada ibn Dirana, Ibn Muwaffaq bin Din Muzaffar, and Darab. All were important contributors to our modern civilization. Ata ibn Ali Rabbah, he was black, couldn't fully walk, and was partially paralyzed, and was yet known as the greatest mufti in Mecca. Inclusion was offered to everyone, regardless of their physical ability. Later on, at the Ottoman court in the 16th and 17th century, servants who were deaf, had hearing impairment, taught sign language to courtiers and sultans when it became a recognized means of communication. This was during a period when Western Europeans were still debating whether deaf people were capable of learning anything or thinking as rational beings. The proper behavior towards disabled people is an example for us all to follow, as well as the shining record of Islamic historic figures. Many examples of people who were having some kind of disability were included and had prominent status in society, such as the figure of Abdullah bin Maktoum, who was blind and was among the first to accept and embrace Islam, and he was devoted to the Prophet, and he became one of the main muezzins, caller of the prayer, at the time. And on several occasions, the Prophet placed him in charge of Medina in his absence. This is just one example of inclusion that shows how people with disabilities were looked upon and treated in Islam. There are many other figures There's a guy who's called Amr ibn Jumrah. He had a limp, and he wanted to join the Islamic army at the time, and his sons thought, how can you can't even walk properly. Yet the Prophet said, if he wants to join, let him be. You can't decide on his behalf, what he should and shouldn't do. And he did join the fight. Eventually he died, but he did what he wanted and contributed to what he felt was his role in Islamic history. Aisha's wife, Aisha, the Prophet's wife, sister, Asma bint Abu Bakr, was visually impaired as well. And but it didn't stop her from participating in society. She would join the prayers and had the help of Aisha, her sister, who would tell her when to stand up, when to lean down, when to kneel, and perform all the rituals, to make her feel part of the community and that she is participating with her fellow Muslims. Imam al-Bukhari, who collected all the hadith of the Prophet, he was visually impaired, and it was his mother who pushed him and made sure that he was progressing. And I think that I read somewhere that she kept praying that his eyesight was restored, not because she thought it was anything that made him less, but she wanted him to have his full capability to do what he wants. As we know, the Prophet Moses, he had speech impairment, and yet God chose him to deliver the message to the pharaohs, and that wasn't an issue. His physical disability did not make him less than anyone else. Again, I have the understanding of Islamic history towards those with disability, representing the importance of not only showing acceptance, but also making places accessible, so that those with disability could focus on cultivating their abilities, raising awareness of the importance of providing accessible places of worship, as well as alternative formats to increase level of worship, such as Braille Quran, or providing ramps for wheelchair users, or using sign language as speakers and interpreters with those who cannot hear. The provision of accessibility doesn't just make it easier for the disabled to have a place accessible or for them to feel accepted, but provides a positive sign of belief that those with disabilities can have a substantial impact in society. In the UK, there are 2.7 Muslims, and of that percent, 6.3 are disabled. Yet, it's very rare that I come across active disabled figures within the community. I know there's a couple of organizations that do, there's a Disabled Muslim Network, and I think there's another disabled organization which specializes in the Muslim community. But at the time, I think I spoke to the person who runs it, and I said, why does it have to be just Muslims? Why can't it be more about the whole disabled community? And she said to me, and I at the time I didn't realize that, but now I do, that the Muslim community does have different needs to the wider community, to the wider disabled community. But the problem is that we tend to associate disability with religion. If we like a person, then we'll say, oh, because God's going to compensate them in later life. And if we really don't like the person, we'll say, yeah, God knows what she's done or he's done, that they become this way. There's this constant assumption and judgment that follows a disabled person. If you fast, I remember during Ramadan, people always say to me, why don't you fast? And I did used to, and then I stopped when I realized that I can't do it anymore. And I would say to them, I just can't. They say, oh, but God will help you. And I'm like, no, I really can't. I've tried it and I can't. And they would say, oh, but so-and-so, he's in a worse position and he does it and he got so much better afterwards. And I was like, it's not for me. I don't want to do it. I'm okay. I'm not saying don't fast, but you've got to find a balance of knowing when to do it and when not to. Your health should be the most important thing. In the Quran, it says there's a verse that says, don't throw yourself into, the fire or something like that, which means that you really have to. God has given you something that you've got to protect and that you've got to look after. I pray differently to everyone else because I can't stand up. It doesn't mean that my prayers are not accepted. Maybe in the eyes of others, I'm doing it wrong. But as long as I have the right intention, then God will accept it. I spoke about Hajj. I interviewed a girl, a severely disabled wheelchair user. She did Hajj a few years ago. She had to pay the same amount as an average person going to a pilgrimage. Yet she couldn't perform all the rituals because certain things like the throwing of the stone, she couldn't perform because the wheelchair wouldn't get there. So why should a person pay the same amount and yet they don't have the same facilities? She had to use a manual wheelchair because the electric wheelchair wasn't suitable. Taxis or transport wasn't 100% accessible. They didn't have a ramp. So she had to rely on others to help her all the time. There was no special provision for her. She had to rely on the tour guide to make sure that he had arranged all the transport in advance so that she could get to places, etc. Hotels weren't that great either. This is something that should be a fundamental right of everyone. Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. If you're excluding certain community from it, or certain group of people, then you're not doing your job properly. You're not getting across the right message, not just to your followers, but to the wider population. Mosque, I did a short 2 weeks research on mosque not even in the whole UK, just London. I thought, let me just try this. So many mosques in London. I found about 20. I found 3 that are accessible. And of these 3, they are actually the richest mosque that I know of anyway. The main mosque, London Central Mosque, they say they have access, but having spoken to people who've been there, the lifts are too small, the washrooms are not accessible, the women's prayer areas is awful to get to. You need to get you need to get a manual wheelchair. If you go on their website, and I'm talking about every mosque now, not just the London ones, there is nothing about accessibility. So it's pure luck if you're going to phone, whether they will answer to check if they're accessible or not, and whether you're actually going to get someone who knows what they're talking about. Because when I phoned, I kept saying, do you have access? And they had no idea what I meant. And I had to explain steps, stairs, things. And in the end, he said to me, oh, sorry, you're not eligible. I'm like, why am I not eligible? He said, oh, because you use a wheelchair. It's like, okay, great. The only mosque that I was really impressed by was the East London Mosque. Not only do they have access for wheelchair users, but they have the sermons in British Sign Language, and they have help for the visually impaired. From what I understood from the person I spoke to is that they have a contract with a group or organization called Istishara, and they actually cater for people with disability. So they are employed by the mosque to make sure it's fully accessible. But this is the only mosque that I came across which offered to all disabled people and not just have a ramp and say we're accessible, because there are disabled people are not just wheelchair users. I'm going to end with this story because I really like it. It's about the Prophet who met a woman who suffered from epilepsy and quite severe epileptic fits. And she expressed her concern to him that her body would become exposed during such episodes. And the Prophet offered the woman two choices. He could either pray to God that she could have access to paradise if she patiently resigned herself to the condition, or he could ask God to heal her. And she opted to bear her condition with patience, but also asked the Prophet to pray that her body might no longer become exposed to the view of strangers. And to me, this story highlights three important points. First, it illustrates the value of patience and forbearance on part of the person with the disability, but more importantly, it affirms the right of individuals to draw attention to their special needs and to speak out for their rights as a matter of social justice. Finally, the story also points to the important roles of advocacy and the support which the wider community is expected to provide to the individual. We need to move away from cultural habits and views, leave prejudice and discrimination behind, and focus on our own individual acts, and collectively, as a society, make the world better. Ultimately, reflecting on some of Islam's teaching in seeking knowledge, promoting equality, and showing compassion. And to do that is through education. And education was what made Islamic civilization one of the greatest, but unfortunately has fallen prey to prejudice, cultural and traditional teaching, and misguided views. And basically, my view, we should go back to a few decades ago, to the days of equality and coexistence, which I don't see happening at the moment. Thank you.